Welcome back to the Bible Study Podcast. In this episode, it's time to get to some real work. So put on a pot of coffee, sharpen your knives, and tie your hair back. We're going to start doing some analysis about what we've been reading in this episode of the Bible 101 Podcast. Up to this point, we've been doing observation, right? So we've read the text over and over and over. And then in the last episode, we covered outlines, how to create your different outlines. The survey and summarization outline, where you kind of take a high-level summary of all the different components of the book or the chapter. And you kind of, title the sections and summarize the sections. And then our data outline, which is more of a list, where we kind of write down all the different things that that are mentioned, like who, what, when, where, places, events, that kind of thing. What we've done so far has been pretty simple. Not a lot of training required on reading, right? Everybody probably has a certain level of reading capability, certain level of reading comprehension. The same with organization. Organizing your thoughts just takes a little bit of time, a little bit of practice, but it's not that hard, right? The learning curve is pretty shallow. Now we're getting into analysis. And if you want to learn how to analyze a text, there are college level courses, multiple series courses that you can go take to learn how to analyze a text. That's not what we're doing here. I want to give you a few basic tools. This is Bible Study 101. I want to give you a few basic tools on how to analyze the text that you've been reading. And these tools can be used against any kind of text. Text would be the wrong word there. These tools can be used against any kind of literary or literature creation. So film, music, books, whether the book be a genre book like science fiction or fantasy, or a more literary book. Think Great Gatsby, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Where the Red Fern Grows, Catcher in the Rye. These would be literary books. I don't read a lot of those. Those are the ones I read in high school. I'm sure there have been plenty published in the last 20 years since then. I'm more of a science fiction and fantasy guy myself, throwing in a few thrillers every now and then. And the analysis tools you would use on any one of those books, or film, or music, same thing you would use when studying the Bible. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about 4 basic categories of rhetorical relationships that we want to look for. And I'm going to give you some questions, and these questions are the tools that you want to ask anything you're watching or listening or reading. And it's these questions that are going to allow you to kind of really dig in to the elements of the structure of whatever it is you're watching, reading, or listening to. It's going to help you do a detailed examination. Now, a quick point on interpretation here. As we move toward interpretation, analysis is kind of the bridge between observation and interpretation. So remember the 3 steps: observation, interpretation, and application. And analysis is that bridge. Because you'll notice as we go through the categories and we look at some questions that we can use for analysis, that we're kind of walking that line of trying to identify the meaning of the text, or the meaning of the scene, or the meaning of the chapter. And these questions are going to help us pull all that out. And then when we get all this pulled out, we're going to be able to use the the hermeneutic that we're going to talk about later, the actual interpretive hermeneutics, to kind of like better understand the elements that we've just analyzed. So let's get to it. So we're looking at rhetorical relationships. And the 4 rhetorical relationships, the 4 categories that we're going to be looking at are juxtaposition, contrast, repetition, and shift. You could always rewind and listen to this again, but it bears repeating. I will repeat it one more time. The 4 rhetorical relationship categories that we're going to be talking about are juxtaposition, contrast, repetition, and shift. And what I'm going to try to do is give you decent examples of each category as we go through them. And rhetorical relationship, what is meant by that is it's just how two segments are logically connected to one another. So if you have two objects or two events, or an object and an event that are put near each other in the text or on the screen, the rhetorical relationship is how those two objects are related and what it can mean. The first one we're going to talk about is juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is when you set two things next to each other to highlight contrast or create comparisons, and this is generally used to create meaning. So let's cover two examples. First example is a movie, and this is one of my favorite movies. It's The Dark Knight. It's the second in the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy. If you haven't seen it, that's your homework, right? Who gets movies for homework? I'm giving you a movie for homework, especially if you've never seen it. Why haven't you seen this movie if you haven't seen this movie? Seriously, that's sad. So I want to talk about a scene in the movie. It's about an hour and 2 minutes in. So if you want to just go watch this scene, it's only a couple of minutes. It doesn't spoil anything, right? But there's going to be a juxtaposition of two characters and those characters' actors. So remember, a juxtaposition is two things basically set side by side for contrast or comparison. And the director in this case is trying to create meaning. He's adding emphasis to the overall story. Now, if you watch the whole movie, you get themes of, say, morality or contrasting morality between the morality of the Joker and the morality of Batman. And in this scene, about 1 hour and 2 minutes in, you have Batman who's starting to do an interrogation of somebody that he caught. And you have Harvey Dent, another character, who's also doing an interrogation of somebody that they caught. And those two individuals, say, interrogation techniques are interlaced with each other throughout this 3 or 4 minutes. Batman talks to his guy his way, and Harvey Dent talks to his guy his own way. I want you to go watch this scene, take a look at the way there's are connected, and see if it is saying anything about the movie in general, specifically concerning the ideas of, say, morality or justice, law, and what links are legitimate and to close the gap between justice and law. Is that a legitimate thing to try to do? This movie actually tackles those subjects in the superhero genre. It's probably one of the best superhero movies, and it's definitely why it's one of my favorite movies. But Harvey Dent and Batman are juxtaposed to each other. They're compared to each other in their interrogation styles. And you'll see that Batman's is brutal and Harvey Dent's is more psychological. So Batman is physically brutal and Harvey Dent is more psychological. But as we analyze whatever it is we're watching or listening or reading, we want to identify these characters, events, or other story elements or narrative elements that are set next to each other. Sometimes they're set next to each other very closely, like the case in this scene in this movie. Sometimes they're set far apart in the narrative, but there is a through line, a logical connection between those. Off the bat, the ones that are close together, they're going to be easier to spot. And as you do this more and more, as you look for these items that are juxtaposed, you're going to start picking it up more and more. So as you see these, you want to be able to write them down. But here's your question, right? So here's the tool. What is juxtaposed? What is placed side by side for the sake of comparison? And what does this comparison emphasize? Here in the Batman story, it's about the lengths somebody is willing to go to achieve an end. And this actually has greater implications in the overall movie, especially when it's compared to Joker and what he thinks everybody is actually capable of. It's something that comes up towards the end of the movie. Again, that's your homework. Go watch that movie. Another example I want to cover for juxtaposition comes from the Bible. And if you want to follow along, this is Matthew chapter 13. And Christ is answering a question in regards to the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. And Christ responds with some basically metaphors. And metaphors, remember, are a type of juxtaposition because you're saying one thing is like something else. You're taking two things and you're logically connecting them. That's a rhetorical relationship. So Christ says the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. That's verse 44. He also says in verse 45, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. Again, in verse 47, he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that is thrown down into a lake and caught and catches all kinds of fish. So these are all three comparisons of one kind or another where Christ is using a particular element of each one of those juxtaposed objects to try to say something about heaven. Anytime you read something, look for juxtaposition. So go read a bunch of stuff for the next few days. Novels, narratives, short stories, short books in the Bible. And what I want you to do is just look for elements or objects, characters, events, places, and they don't all have to be parallel to each other, right? So it doesn't have to be two characters. It could be a character and an object. It could be a character and a place. It could be just juxtaposed. A character's actions, two characters' actions could be juxtaposed. So go read a bunch of stuff and look just for that. Just look for that. Okay, don't worry about the reading it over and over and over again. Don't worry about the outlines. If you want to get better at finding juxtaposition, you have to go out and look for juxtaposition. Now, there's a bunch of different types of juxtaposition. I don't want to cover all of it. I just want you to go out and find two things that are close to each other and circle it, point it out, and then ask the question, what impact does it have on the story? Right? What is it that the author or the creator, if it's an artist, or the director, if it's a film, what are they trying to emphasize with that? Just take a guess. Just think about it for a second. Okay? So that's your homework for juxtaposition. And now we're going to move into rhetorical shift. So a good definition of rhetorical shift that I can find is this. It refers to a change in mood or attitude that is typically accompanied by a corresponding change in the focus and language of a literary scene, a passage, a theme. And this can take place in movies, music, art. It doesn't matter. So shift is a change in tone. Okay, it's a change in mood. It's a change in attitude. And when an author wants to compare to, say, two ideas, like maybe you have a moral dilemma, and you have one character explain their view of the moral dilemma, whatever that moral dilemma might be. And you could have the character either speak it or you're inside the character's mind, right? The author gives you the thoughts of the character. But now the author wants to give the opposing side. So they bring a new character into the story. Somebody else comes onto the scene. Or maybe that scene ends. It's a whole nother scene with a whole different character. And they explain their view of the moral dilemma, their side of it, which would be in contrast to the other person's view of moral dilemma. Now I'm going to stick with the moral dilemma idea for a second, but remember, we're still talking about rhetorical shift. So in the book of Job, remember, there is a juxtaposition between God and Satan, and they're going to kind of deal with the faith of Job. So Job gets everything taken away, right, in short order. And you have a lengthy section on Job's friends coming and trying to explain what's going on to Job. Now, every time one of those friends starts talking, you have a shift. You have a few different types of shift in those kind of monologues from Job's friends. You have a shift in tone. You have a shift in character. You have a shift in outlook. And if you want to try to kind of dig down to what Job is really about, the book of Job, not the person of Job, and you're trying to understand the meaning, right? You have to be able to identify those shifts. So this is just another thing that you need to look out for. Where does the text shift? Where does it change? Where does this text shift here? Where does it shift there? Does it shift anywhere? And how does this shift affect the overall message? Does it matter that Job had friends come and give their explanations for what was going on? What impact does that have on the entire book of Job? And now, if you want to start answering the question of the meaning of Job, you have to do these 4 analysis categories, these rhetorical relationship categories. You got to find the juxtaposition. You got to find the shifts. You got to find the contrast, and you got to find the repetitions. So we've covered juxtaposition and we've covered shift. Now let's talk about repetition. So repetition is pretty simple, right? This is really easy to identify because it happens again and again and again and again and again and again. So pay attention for repetition. Words and phrases used over and over. These are words and phrases that may show up slightly different, might be slightly altered in how it's used. And as you're reading, the question you should be asking is, what is repeated in the text? And what does this repetition emphasize? So as you're watching The Dark Knight, you should be asking yourself, what words are used over and over? What phrases are used over and over? What concepts or ideas are constantly brought up? Maybe that has something to do with what the movie is about. And it's the same when you're reading a book of the Bible. What words are used over and over? What concepts are brought up? What ideas are dealt with on a regular basis? Maybe that has something to do with the meaning of the book. Now, you may notice that there's a repetition of something that happens only in one section of the book. Make note of that. Remember, we have a whole outline that we've already done. That's going to help you as you're going through in this analysis part of observation. That outline is going to help you pull out all these repetitions and maybe kind of cordon off where they take place. So you might have repetition that takes place in the first third of a book, but it never happens again. Does that itself have any meaning? Like, why is that there or not there for that matter? Now, if you want to kind of get to the meaning of the book, this is the kind of analysis that you have to do. And in order to do it, you got to have these tools, right? Juxtaposition, contrast, shift, and repetition. So do the repetition work. I mean, find what's repeated. Now, as you're reading through, you're probably not going to be able to focus, especially if you've never done this before, you're not going to be able to focus on juxtaposition, contrast, shift, and repetition all at the same time. And that's fine. Just pick one of these and go through the book just looking for that. On to the last one, which is contrast. Contrast is similar to juxtaposition because you have different objects that are set next to each other. But this is used to emphasize the differences. Think Star Wars episode 5, right? Return of the Jedi. I can't believe I brain farted on Return of the Jedi. But there's a scene when Luke has been captured and he is walking with his father. And you have this contrast between Luke in his white outfit and Darth Vader in his black outfit. This is a contrast. This is chosen by the director to emphasize, whether it be ham-handed or otherwise, to emphasize the light versus the dark. And let's go back to The Dark Knight again. Remember, your homework. Go watch this movie. Now, Christopher Nolan, when he was writing this movie, he had to come up with villains for Batman, right? Now, the primary villain for this movie is the Joker. But a secondary villain for this movie is Two-Face. Two-Face is, in himself, a contrast. Half of his face is all scarred and marred and represents evil or chaos, and the other half of his face represents justice. And the character Two-Face, who comes out of Harvey Dent, is this kind of contrasting morality that he has to live by. And this is a character that is specifically chosen for this movie. I mean, Christopher Nolan could have picked any other villain. He didn't even have to have a second villain, right? He could have just gone with the Joker. But he chose a villain that is in and of itself a contrast. So that is a character that is in and of itself a contrast. And what impact does that have on the story? What is Christopher Nolan trying to emphasize by using that character? And you want to identify these contrasts in everything you're reading. So let me try to give you a couple biblical examples. If you're reading through Genesis, chapter 4 is about the lineage of Cain, and chapter 5 is about the lineage of Seth. Now, these two chapters are in contrast to one another in the way they describe the descendants of those two individuals. Go read those chapters. See if there's a contrast. Another example of contrast is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. So you have two different kinds of people. One is dirt poor, one is very rich. So there is a contrast in this parable. There's something going on that a contrast is being leveraged to communicate. Now, in order to get to the meaning of all this stuff, I've said it, multiple times, right? In order to get to the meaning of what we're reading, we want to try to identify these rhetorical relationships. And these rhetorical relationships, again, are juxtaposition, rhetorical shift, contrast, and repetition. So as you go through whatever you're reading or go through whatever you're watching, pay attention for those things. I would recommend just pick one of them, go through it, right? Then pick another one and go through it. So pick contrast, find all the contrasts that you could find. You might not get all of them. Who cares? Just practice it. Then once you've gone through and found the contrast, then go through and look for the shifts. Where are there narrative shifts? Where are there tonal shifts? Are there characters coming in or leaving? Is there a big break in the narrative? Right? Do we move from one location to another? Those are all shifts. Those are all changes in the flow of the text, right? Make note of that. Do it with all four of these. And once you've done that, then you can begin to do the work of interpretation. So this analysis is the foundation for our interpretation. And the analysis is kind of the capstone of our observation. So you have read the book multiple times. Hopefully you've read it out loud at least once. Maybe you've even listened to it. And you've made your outline. Now you're going to go through and you're going to look for these four categories. And you're going to ask all the questions that I've mentioned. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to say them again real quick here. So we're looking for repetition. So what's the question you're asked? What is being repeated in the text? And what does that repetition emphasize? And we're looking for contrasts. So does the text contain a contrast? There may not always be a contrast, especially in a shorter text. Where does this contrast occur? It occurs somewhere for a particular reason, right? And what is this contrast trying to emphasize? Juxtaposition. Where's the juxtaposition in the text? What are the two things being placed side by side, and what comparison is being made, and what does that emphasize? And where does the shifts take place? The change in tone and character and topic and narrative and location. All those are shifts. Where does that take place? And how does that affect the overall message? And as you do the work of this analysis, you're going to notice that a theme starts to emerge. You might start actually picking up on what the theme of the book is, or what the theme of the movie is, or the theme of the piece of music that you're listening to. But themes are for another time, and we will get into themes. So that's all for now. Go out, do your homework, watch The Dark Knight, apply these four categories of questions against the movie, right? Make some notes, and then go do this to whatever you're studying in the Bible. Make some notes. Add these notes to your outlines. Do another outline. Collect your thoughts. That's what your notebook is for. So have fun with this, and it's okay if it takes a while. This part is not easy. This is where the real work is done, and try to enjoy it. This is really good. This is where you really get to dig in. This is really kind of get to start chomping down on what you've been watching or what you've been listening. So go enjoy the homework, and until next time, if you have any questions, email us at newsif@yahoo.com. That is newsif@yahoo.com. And if I've, if you think I've missed something or you want me to kind of cover something a little bit more in depth in what are these 4 categories, email us, let us know, and I'll do another podcast. I'll dive a little bit deeper. But this, what I've given you right now, should be enough to get started. You should be able to watch The Dark Knight and look for one of those 4 categories or all of those 4 categories. So go out into the darkness and, shed some light with your new analytical skills. Until next time, goodbye.